Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Those who are joining me today, welcome to my show. Today, I would love to make this show on relationships actually a very much discussion show. So I would love to hear, where are you joining me from today? Where are you based? What time is it there? And also, of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them because I'm more than happy to answer them live. Today is Friday, and usually on Fridays, we speak about relationships. Why do we speak about relationships? Well, because usually this is the time when actually we are going into the weekend, we have some plans, we usually plan time to have with our family, to spend some quality moments, create memories, and yet, not everybody is in this position. And after working for so many years with many couples and also individuals on their relationships as well as their life. But as you know, relationships are always affecting your life, and your life is always affecting your relationships. I realized there's one important theme which must be addressed, and it is domestic abuse. Whether it is violence, domestic abuse, or we can call it differently, it is still quite traumatic. And it is quite damaging. And you know what's interesting? It's not like only women suffer from that. Also, men suffer from domestic abuse and violence. That's why I decided to bring this topic on the top of the surface and actually discuss it with you. So if you have any questions, or if you have any interesting stories, interesting examples, feel free to type them so we can share with people, inspire them, and also educate them. And I must say, my very first and very traumatic experience of domestic abuse was through my friend. When she had to run away from her husband, he was beating and raping her with her child, with literally just having what she had on herself, and she had to run away. And that is quite scary. And then I had clients. I had women and men. And I must say, very often, this is the most dangerous thing, that very often people don't even recognize that they are in relationships which are abusive. Before I go into the important topic, let me just see, where have you joined me from? I can see people from Saudi Arabia. I can see people from UK, which is amazing. I can see people from USA as well. By the way, I'm live right now on 3 platforms, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. So you may or may not see all the comments, but feel free to comment and feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel, where actually there is more and more information every day. And on a regular basis, I have guests coming to my show. But also because I have messages to speak to you about, I come sometimes here on my own. So shall we go into types of abuse, right? And I really want to highlight the types of abuse because I want you to be aware of them. Because it could be yourself, or it could be somebody whom you love who actually is in one of these types of abusive relationships. And because some of the abusive relationships and violence and abuse are so subtle, and of course it doesn't happen overnight, very rarely people can even recognize that. So it's really important to pay attention that actually, and some people say there are 4, there are 7, but actually there are 10 types of abuse. Are we ready to go into the discussion? Right, so first of all, and the most common one which people are aware of, is physical abuse. And I will talk more about details, but let me just go through all of them so at least you're aware. And maybe some of them will actually ring a bell in your head, in your mind, or maybe you will remember some of your friends being in those situations, or maybe family members, right? So first one is physical abuse. Physical abuse is quite popular, because very often it is the easiest one. You only have to get angry and then abusive, which is not supported. I am absolutely against that, but this is one of the most common ones. The next one is actually sexual abuse. Right? It is sexual abuse, which again is happening also in relationships and also in families. Not necessarily it is just a single person walking on the street. No, it also happens in their family. So let's remember that it's really important to know that there is such a thing as a sexual abuse. And I will talk about this in details as well. Next one is actually something separate, which is domestic violence, right? Or we just call it sometimes abuse. Yeah, but it is more like violence. And then psychological or emotional abuse, which very often we don't even pay attention because, well, we're all emotional creatures, right? And we all live in a world of just being emotional or not emotional. And I'll talk about this more because you'll be surprised how potentially and probably you were in emotional abusive relationships before, because there are some details which are quite common among so many relationships. Right? So the next one is financial or material abuse. And probably you're thinking, how is it even possible? What does it mean, financial abuse? And I will talk about this in a minute. Modern slavery, we heard about that. It is awful. And I must say all of them are absolutely awful. None of this is acceptable. None of this you want to experience or you want your partner to go through or your family member. But modern slavery is something that unfortunately still exists. Right? Discriminatory abuse. This one actually you are discriminated. And married foreigners probably are aware of that. But what is interesting is not only about the nationality. It's not only about where you came from. There are more to that, which I will talk about in a minute. And next thing is quite interesting because people very rarely pay attention to this, but it is organizational or institutional abuse. And I'm sure you will be able to come up with some really interesting examples or stories about that, but probably you just did not pay attention before, right? And then neglect or acts of omission. Very often we say, why neglect me? Without realizing that actually it is a form of abuse. So I really want to address this issue today because so many clients of mine, they went through abuse or domestic violence or many other types of abuse, and it is damaging. Whether it was in your past or you're going through that right now, you definitely need to make sure you deal with that. And the last one is self-neglect. It is also an abuse. Let me just see this comment on Facebook. Mashua is saying, happy to know that regarding this issue, you have considered women and men both. It is a very important and timely topic. Go ahead, Olga. Regards, Mashua. Yes, you are so right. Yes, of course I will address this towards men as well because I know they are suffering from that. And the reason why I know, because I worked with them. Right? I work with them and I know the pain and I know how much they're suffering. And therefore, we definitely need to make sure that we are aware of that and also that other people are aware of that. So please, if you really want to help the world, make sure you share this video. On Facebook, you can make a watch party or you can just send the link to YouTube or LinkedIn right now so other people actually can also see this. It is really important to address this because without that, we actually gonna be, this is really scary. We're gonna be living in these abusive relationships forever. Because if you don't change it now, you know what happens? Family members remember that. Children watch you if you are in abusive relationships and they learn from you. They learn from your behavior that you don't leave your partner, or if you are abusive or you were abusive, they learn from you. So we need to address this issue right now to as many people as we can because unfortunately many people suffer from that. And also I had guests who were coming to my show with some of their terrific stories. And I must say it is quite scary sometimes. Right? So here we go. Shall we go into specifics of abuse? So let's start with the most common one, which is a physical abuse. You'll be surprised how often actually it happens. And there are some signs of physical abuse which you definitely need to be aware of, right? It's not only injuries, but also it could be something to do with the lifestyle. Injuries which just happening as a result of lifestyle, right? And again, it could be something what people are throwing at you, or could be bruising, it could be cuts. Right? It could be also burns or marks on the body. It could be anything that actually is damaging to your body. Very often it also involves hair loss in clumps, when somebody is pulling your hair too tight and then you lose your hair. Right? So let's be aware of this, because actually it's really important to remember that it is day-to-day things which are happening. And if you see somebody is heavily bruised, if you see somebody is not showing healthy signs, then maybe it's worth asking them. But you know what's interesting? Very rarely they will be able to answer honestly, because they're not aware. Because they think, and this is the dangerous thing, they think it only happened once and it will never happen again. So here it's important to remember, if something happened once, potentially it will never happen again. But if something happened twice, there's almost a guarantee it's going to happen again. So you should be definitely able to help those people whom you see they're bruised, whom you see they have cuts, whom you see they're behaving in a really strange and unusual way, because that could be actually a sign, right? Also, very often people say, oh, I just hit myself against the cupboard, or I just fall, right? So sometimes those falls could be as a result of a push, right? Which is also a physical abuse. So it's really important to actually make sure you are of this. But also what happens, often people refer to go to doctors. Right? You see them being bruised, you see them falling, you see them coming up with all the excuses, and they never really go to a doctor. But that's because they are afraid. They are also, which is really scary, they are ashamed, right? So here it's really important to address this and just sometimes maybe ask more questions, and also bringing some examples. And this would actually help so many of my clients to open up. Because even though they come to me, not always do want to start with abuse. And only through examples or through questioning, when they actually reveal that there are some memories, and when we have to go into those memories, they're not pleasant. But the beautiful thing is, once you learned what it was, you can escape it in the future, because you are aware of that and because you're able to recognize that. But let's remember the most important thing, whether it is physical abuse or many other types which we're going to go through, that it always starts in a very subtle way, right? And what happens, you start excusing your partner and you think, well, that only happened once. Or, well, maybe it was my fault. Maybe I did that. And what happens, it happens again and you are still tolerant. And it happens again and you raise your tolerance again. Just like with alcohol, think about it. If you never drank alcohol before in your life, most likely you'll be drunk after 1 or 2 glasses. But if you drink a bottle of wine every day, it's not gonna even harm you, right? Well, of course it will, but you will not show any signs of being even tipsy because your tolerance to alcohol increase. But the same happens with abuse. Right? It happens in a very subtle way, but more often it happens, you get more tolerant and you don't recognize. But that build up is really important to see at some point, right? And very often you also will see signs of malnutrition. Somebody who is, well, really strangely super skinny, and all of a sudden they're just, not overnight obviously, but you see them really quickly losing weight because maybe they're under stress. Right? Especially if you don't say why they're losing weight. Or somebody who actually is going the other way around and they increase in their weight. They are becoming bigger and bigger and you think, what's going on with you? And they're just like, oh, well, I'm just stressed. That could be that emotional eating as a result of a physical abuse, right? So let's remember that. So what about you? Have you experienced some types of physical abuse? Or maybe you know somebody who experienced that. Do you have any stories? Do you have any examples how actually it can happen? Client of mine, this is a really scary story. Obviously, I will never mention any names for confidentiality purposes. This is my promise to all my clients. I'll never share any names or any other personal details. But client of mine, and you will think this is really strange, but it's not. Client of mine, she was for 12 years in relationships where her partner was not only beating her privately, but also once smashed her car from behind. So he drove into her car with his car at a really high speed next to the house. And then her car went straight to the wall. So her legs were trapped. He pulled her out of the car. Kids were sitting at the back seat. He pulled her out of the car. Her legs were broken and he beat her up. And you'll be surprised how she actually felt guilty. She felt that it was something to do with her. She felt that she was wrong. There is no explanation to behavior like that. There is no such a thing what actually can make you behave like that towards that person. And that damaged her really, really badly. She was so scared to start any other relationships because subconsciously she believed next man will be just like that. And you know what's interesting? She grew up in domestically abusive relationships. Her father used to beat her mom. So of course, when you see these type of examples in your life since your childhood, of course you get used to and you think this is normal. So we had to have a session on that with her, for her to recognize that what was happening was not normal. And she needs to let it go because eventually he left her for somebody else and she was crying and she was not able to get over that. And as a result, she came to me because she thought there's some chance she can return him. So you see, it can become really addictive because again, there are really deep internal issues which people start having as a result of that. Because what abusers do very often, they would treat you really nicely and then really badly and then really nicely again. And that's why they can be quite challenging to leave abusive relationships, right? So let me just see what comments we have here. It's really interesting. Palesa asks this question. If they don't ask for help, how do you help? You see, by working in this industry for so long, I already can tell the signs of people being in unhealthy relationships, right? And also myself, I experienced similar things. So I can relate to many things which my clients were experiencing before or still experience. So for me to spot signs is very often quite easily. I would say 95% I can see what's going on just by body language, by the way how they use the conversation, which way it goes, and the way how they answer my questions, right? So, and here it's all about me showing the importance of them being in a healthy relationships and also questioning them whether they are happy in the current relationships, right? Not whether it is normal, not whether the partner is wrong or right, whether they are happy. And the most important question which I usually ask my clients is, if that would be your son or your daughter in these type of relationships, what would you tell them? And you'll be surprised how many people actually start crying after that. They open up and then they are ready to deal with that. Right? Because very often we can tolerate so much, but when we put our children in our shoes, that opens up our eyes and we realize, no, I would never want that kind of partner for my child, right? So again, and in terms of how you can help as a dear listener right now, it is about bringing some examples to them and saying, you could even make up some examples. And I say, sometimes that little example which will be made up or maybe a story somewhere else will help them to stop and think. So you can just address or maybe a story from somebody and just have a discussion and watch what happens. And of course, we can go into argument whether you should get involved or not. I would say if you do get involved, very often you might lose your friend. Because they'll be so protective of their relationships. They'll be so protective of their ego as well. So it is a very, very fragile question. And I would say, probably in that case, it's worth sending them to a specialist. Just saying, don't you think, you need to speak to somebody. And maybe even consider maybe paying for their first session. Just for them to open up. Because think, with that gesture, you could completely transform their lives. Right? So ask them whether if that would be their children or child, if they have only one, in that type of relationship, what would they do? That usually should actually make them talk a little bit more, right? So here we go. Antonia, hello. All sorts of abuse, even just negative comments throw at you, even in a weird joking way, speaking from experience. Absolutely, Antonia. Yes, and I'm going to talk about this more. So spot on. And I must say, I went through that myself. So, yep. But it's quite interesting how in the moment you don't even understand, you don't even realize that, because you think it is just an argument, right? But anyways, let's go through all of them, because I think it's quite important, right? But here, let's talk also about possible signs of domestic violence or abuse, right? As a victim, what happens? You will be having low self-esteem. So if you see somebody is not really confident, they are afraid to go maybe for a better position at work, maybe a better job, maybe they are not confident to ask for a pay rise, maybe they are experiencing challenges in terms of, day-to-day life, in terms of low self-esteem. In addition to other signs, not necessarily just this one, and that means they're in domestic abuse, but in addition to other signs, that could be actually a sign that they are in very abusive relationships, right? So we need to really remember that it's really important to address to people and say, hey, maybe you need to see some help, right? Or maybe sometimes if you go to their property, you visit them, or even maybe some private stuff, and you see there's a damage. Like, once I remember in my past, my partner smashed my phone. And for me, that was straight away a red flag. And I knew, no, that's not going to work out. I'm sorry, I'm leaving. There was not even a question about this. It was just, no, I'm sorry, I'm leaving. You're going to pay for the phone, but I'm going to be leaving. And doesn't matter how much people apologize. If something happens once, as I said earlier, it can happen second time, maybe not. But if something happened twice, there's a guarantee it's going to happen again. Right? So let's remember that actually it is important to make sure you pay attention to details, what happens in your relationship and also what happens in your friends' relationships, right? And also very often you will notice that all of a sudden your friends, as they step into new relationships, they are almost like isolated. They don't see you anymore. They don't see family anymore. And guess what? That's another sign of them being in abusive relationships, because their partner most likely either is talking badly about their family or friends, or literally saying, no, right now you're in relationships and you cannot see your friends, which happens very often. And something what probably you will not hear very often, but it is a sign of domestic abuse, is a limited access to money, especially when partner doesn't work. If they have very limited access to money and no more, it is the way how the abuser is controlling them, right? Because by giving more, they will feel partner will leave, or maybe they will have too much freedom and they will maybe, buy some pleasurable stuff. But this way, at least they hold them in a fear all the time and make sure that they never give actually very much of money, right? And also maybe you heard somebody is literally shouting on the street and maybe in front of friends. It is verbal abuse, right? And humiliation, which is definitely not acceptable. All right. So that was just in terms of domestic abuse, which actually how it can show up. So let's pay attention to that. The next one is sexual abuse, which I know probably you heard about quite a lot when people are sexually abused, whether they are very young as children, maybe they are young adults, or even being in a marriage. And you'll be surprised how many partners actually are abused in their own marriage, which is very, very shocking, because marriage should be such a beautiful thing. It should be such a union. It should be almost like a little castle where two people creating beautiful future. And the way how you can recognize that, it's quite challenging in terms of physical way, because very often bruises will be near intimate places, right? But also could be in the upper arms. So if you see people very often are covering their arms, or by accident you notice they're bruised, just ask them a question. But also neck, because abusers can strangle, abusers can just harm. So make sure you do pay attention to your friends and family members, or even people on the street. Sometimes a conversation to a stranger can change their life, right? So it's really important to remember that very often you can be the person who will be that beginning of a massive change. If you notice people are wearing some damaged clothing, that could be a sign as well, because maybe as they were running away, the abuser was holding them by the sleeve and they left the sleeve, but they actually left their body safe, and they just escaped, which is good. But think about it, right? Nobody would do that. So if that's the case, if your friend ran to you or just called you in really despair and being quite anxious, and you see them and they show signs of their clothing being quite damaged, ask them what's happening, right? If you see them struggling to walk or sit, ask what happened, because maybe they were punched in their legs, or maybe, they were raped. And in that case, if it was very rough, obviously it's gonna damage intimate places. Doesn't matter which ones, but yeah, it could happen to anybody, man and woman. And let's remember that many young boys are abused by their elderly, stepbrothers, or even native brothers. And again, it's quite easy to say abusers are awful, but very often what happens at the young age, especially in the childhood by other children, very often it happens because of curiosity and because of unhealthy relationships in a family, right? When you see unhealthy relationship in the family, this one, it becomes for you normal. So your curiosity becomes abnormal, right? So that happens left, right, and center. Let's not neglect that also men are experiencing sexual abuse, right? So lots of things which actually are relatable to sexual abuse. And what I can do, if you want, I can share the link to quite explicit information about these. Will actually be lots and lots of information of more signs and more times. I'm just very mindful of the time. But I must say there's one more thing which you can pay attention to, is which is going quite across all of these types, which is poor concentration in general, withdrawal. If you're here and see they're constantly tired and they refer to poor sleep, they can't sleep, they have sleeping disturbance, and also they are just experiencing self-harming, that could be a sign of that as well, right? So make sure you do pay attention and you help them, because if you don't, you might be not helping them at all, right? Sometimes silence can kill. So let's make sure you actually pay attention. And the last thing which I'll mention here about sexual abuse, it is when they are quite scared to be left alone with a particular type of people, right? If children are too scared to stay with a man or a woman, or a particular type of man and a woman, that could be a sign as well, right? Because why would they be scared of a particular type? All right. So I hope that is helpful, because I know it is important to remember about this. I know it's important to be aware of this, but actually, by helping other people, you can make sure that they have a happy life, right? So it's important to know these signs, and I'll talk more about other types of abuse. So next one is psychological and emotional. And please type below, what do you think it is, psychological or emotional abuse, right? Again, there are lots of other types. I'm not going to go through all of them. The information is all over the internet. You can find out more. But I must say that it is quite important to pay attention to possible signs within your friends or maybe your family members, in terms of recognizing whether they are experiencing that or not, right? So very often, if you see particular children are very tearful, if they're angry, if they're experiencing, like some stories happen to them again and again, maybe they are doing some false claims or something, that could be actually a sign of psychological and emotional abuse, right? Because now they start living in their own unique world, right? So very often also withdrawal, as I said earlier, is a possible sign as well. And you see, very often you think, well, but what if I'm just not in the mood today? You know what? It happens. And I always say, it doesn't mean if you have low self-esteem, which is also a sign of psychological abuse, that you straight away web psychological abuse. But it could be in addition to many other signs. For example, if you are quite aggressive in your behavior, that's because you can't respond back to your abuser, and you're building up this anger within yourself, and also you're withdrawn, and also you have, let's say, insomnia, and also you have, let's say, you're quite tearful as well as angry, and maybe you also lost your appetite, or you're increasing in your weight. These all in combination. It's quite a strange combination, right? So here, this all what I mentioned actually are signs of psychological abuse. So don't you think if you're having low self-esteem, that was psychological abuse? It could be because somebody was verbally abusing you, and that's why now you don't believe in yourself. That's why now you doubt yourself. That's why now you think badly about yourself, right? But pretty much there are some signs, which is withdrawal, which is anger, which is changing your weight, which is low self-esteem, which is insomnia, which could be all of them. All of these signs could be signs of abuse one way or another, right? So what about financial or material abuse? Did you come across that? Have you experienced that? I must say, when it comes to financial or material abuse, it's something what not many people really pay attention, but actually it should be addressed, right? Some things like some of my clients experienced unexpected withdrawals from their common accounts, like the partners' accounts when they had a common account together. That was like, well, I don't understand where the money is gone, and partner doesn't want to give you any explanation, right? Or when staff are missing, right? Especially if these are your personal belongings. Of course, you wouldn't control what they do with their own personal belongings, but if some possessions are missing, especially in the property, that is a sign that actually it is abusive behavior towards you. It could be to manipulate you, it could be to scare you, it could be just so you don't have it, it could be anything else, right? But actually it is just about making sure you start feeling in this fear, you start living in this fear. And that very often what happened actually to very, very close person of mine, it was unexpected lack of money and also inability to maintain lifestyle, right? And I'm going to disclose details, but it happened to one of my family members, and it was quite scary to watch. And because I was able to address it and to mention that, we were able to deal with it quite quickly. But at the same time, it was quite upsetting to hear that it was happening, because it's not something what somebody should go through, right? When you are in your family and all of a sudden there's no money, you start living in a fear. And that's exactly what abuser is trying to achieve, making sure you live in a fear so you don't leave them, right? Because they are trying to manipulate you in every possible way, right? So make sure you do pay attention to stuff like that, because it's quite important to address it if you see something. Like if you see somebody, was given a notice to move out because they haven't paid rent and they're in rent arrears. If they have, proper issues with the finances, ask them questions, right? What about your partner? Is he supporting you? Is she aware of the situation, right? How can you deal with that? Have you been discussing that, right? Just start asking some questions, because sometimes you can actually help them to get to the nitty-gritty of why these things are happening, right? And of course, there's so many things which are in this financial abuse, but I think those few should be definitely be able to help you. Next one is modern slavery. I'm sure you heard of that. I'm sure you know about that. And you can always tell by the signs of physical or emotional abuse. You also can see if somebody is so withdrawn, if somebody's also using drugs because now they're trying to forget themselves, right? But very often it means isolation from where they belong, from their community, from their family, from their friends, from their society, right? From their members for whom they were always spending time, right? And unfortunately, very often it also involves living in the very dirty and unlivable conditions, which you can't really live in. But what is really, really awful, they also work in the same premises. So very often, men and women, including children, can be trapped in a room where they will sleep, where they will eat, and where they will, unfortunately, will be sexually abused, right? So we need to make sure that if you ever come across that, you definitely must report this, right? And therefore, again, it's all about preventing. Be careful. Be careful with whom you go out. Be careful where you travel and with whom you travel. Be aware, right? Be aware of these, because it happens. It happens left, right, and center. If you are aware of this, that means you can prevent it. You can also help other people to prevent this happening to them, or you can also save them, right? Also, if you know that somebody is missing their documents, not like you would come across these people, but if you would come across this person because maybe they run away and they don't have any documents or any ID or anything else, maybe that means that they actually are in a modern slavery, and maybe they run away for a day, and because they have nowhere to go, they will go back. Or maybe because they live in so much fear that they are allowed to go out, which is unacceptable. And by them wearing the same clothing again, and again, you can tell something is not right. Because if somebody is not looking healthy, is so withdrawn, is having some signs of maybe sexual abuse, maybe physical abuse, and you can tell something is wrong because they avoid the eye contact and they're quite scared and frightened. So maybe it is actually a sign of them being in a modern slavery. Because again, they could be let out, but because of the fear of being caught and because of the fear to go to police, they are forced to go back, especially if they're in a foreign country and especially if they have nowhere to go, right? So let's remember that. So what about discriminatory abuse? Have you heard of that? What do you think actually is this discrimination? How does it appear? What happens? There are so many signs of that actually happening, and very often it is anxiety, it is fear, it is anger, it is also frustration. We need to remember that all those signs also could be signs of other types of abuse. But if you see that somebody actually is not willing to communicate, if you see somebody actually is denying, basic rights to healthcare, or maybe they don't want to go into employment, or maybe they want to go into education, that means deep inside of them, in their mind, that already there's a message from their abuser that maybe they're not good enough because of something, right? And it could be really anything, right? But it's all about them hearing their abuser talking to them in terms of their race is wrong, or maybe their age is wrong, maybe disability is wrong, maybe the gender is wrong, or maybe it is a belief, religious or just spirituality, maybe orientation, right? All these verbally could be addressed to this person. And if you see that they are not really themselves all of a sudden, or for a long time you don't understand what's going on with them, just ask them, how do they feel? Right? And maybe potentially they are experiencing an abuse, right? So let's remember, it's really important to pay attention. I'm just checking who is joining me on different platforms, and it's great to see so many people. I really wonder, and I really would love to hear, which one did you come across so far? Not necessarily in your personal life, because I do appreciate maybe you don't want to share it publicly, but which one do you hear about most? Which one have you heard about recently? Maybe in your neighborhood, maybe in your city, maybe in your country. Which one is the most common so far, right? And which one do you think is so much easier to spot, right? Out of all which I mentioned so far. So very often we forget about this particular abuse, which is organizational or institutional. And quite interesting that actually it is all about making people to avoid others, right? It is about residents in your neighborhood. It could be not allowing them to see their family members. It could be not allowing them to see, to complain, to report. It could be just them being kept away from communication in general, right? Because when you see that, that means actually they are rejected of maybe following their religious beliefs and religious traditions. Maybe also they're not able to actually see doctors. Maybe they're not able to celebrate their cultural traditions and things like that, right? It's really important to remember that there's so many things which could be under this particular organizational or institutional abuse, right? And very often you will see that an abuser will talk badly about friends and family or anybody else in the circle of the person who is abused, because they don't want them to go to them and speak about them, so that could be discovered, right? So if you see somebody actually is living maybe in overcrowded property, or maybe in really run down, and you think, oh, that's interesting, why would they live like that? Because maybe they actually are living in very abusive relationships, in very abusive household, right? So here it's quite important to remember that when you see somebody so rigid with their time, they don't have any flexibility on when they can meet or whether they cannot meet, and they can't really give an explanation, it's just no and that's it, it's quite rigid. That could be a sign, right? Because that means they only have allocated time when they actually can go and see somebody, and maybe there should be also a really strong reason for that, right? And also, if you see people are hungry, they're dehydrated, that could be a sign, right? Because they're just not looked after. Again, this sign could be of many other abuse types, right? But particularly here, because they actually already have very poor standards of care. They start neglecting themselves because emotionally they're so traumatized, right? Again, just like before, lack of personal clothing, right? Or any stuff which people just don't have, right? Because they are abused, because they're not given, because somebody is probably taking them away from them, right? So let's remember that if somebody, for example, cannot bring a document, especially if they go for the appointments and they can't bring documents because they can't find them, because again, they are abusive household, right? And this is organizational. So if you think about anything about people organizing documents, anything like that, that could be a sign, if they are struggling within these areas, that actually they are going through abuse, right? So let's remember that again, you pointing out to potential issue that you'll be able to actually help and save somebody else's life. And this is so important, so important, because when you think about it, what can be more beautiful than helping others to recognize they are in unhealthy relationships? Just like one of my clients, it was a male. When he was leaving his relationship, he could not find any of his documents, not even birth certificate, not even his passport, not even his driving license. Absolutely everything was taken and destroyed, right? And you might say, oh yeah, she was angry. Well, guess what? You can't refer to that. You can't refer she was angry. You can only refer to she was abusing his personal possessions, right? So here, it's important to remember, whether something is happening abnormal, it is abnormal. And if it feels wrong, most likely it is wrong, whether it is in your life or somebody else's. Okay? So the next one is neglect and act of omission. And what is that? That means you are living in a really neglected environment, really poor environment. It's very unhygienic and dirty. And I mean, right now it's COVID-19, everybody's washing hands and everybody's trying to do their best to be as sterile as they can. So if you see somebody, and children particularly, they are showing signs of being very dirty, unhygienic, ask their parents, right? Or ask children what is happening. Because again, especially with children, they think this is normal. They haven't seen anything different. So of course, they think that this is how it should be, right? So when you start asking them questions, you might find out more information. You might save another life. Not only right now whilst they're little, but you can also save their lifetime, because that means in the future they will have much healthier relationships, because they will be possibly in a foster family, maybe eventually they'll be adopted, or maybe their parents finally will start working on themselves and they will improve and they will mature and they will look after their children. Because again, going back to, you are the role model of your next generations. So their parents are as well, of those children whom you see being neglected, being dirty, being withdrawn, and just in general having really poor personal hygiene, right? So if you see that, if you see some injuries on children or adults, if you see some medical problems which are unexplained and they're not resolved, they're just there all the time, if you see them kind of becoming quite abusive with the medication, that could be a sign as well, because potentially they just want to heal themselves and they take too much medication, or maybe even they have suicidal thoughts and that's why they just want to misuse medication and to kill themselves, right? So this is quite important to remember, that there are signs. And also think about it, what would you do if you would see a lady or a gentleman walking in during the winter time in the snow in flip-flops, being absolutely bruised, bleeding, and without a sign, you know, them willing to be in this condition, of course, because some people, they're just too hot even in the winter, right? But if you see them inappropriately dressed up for the weather, wouldn't you start asking yourself a question? Why this person dressed up like that? Right? What happens very often, and I know I gave a really drastic example, but one of my clients, she was controlled by her husband what she should wear. She was literally told what to wear, what not to wear, what shoes to put on, what not to put on, whether to wear makeup or not. And again, this is type of abuse, right? Because you can't really be so much under control, right? We need to remember that we have the freedom of choice, and we should be able to actually make sure that we put ourselves first. We ask ourselves a question: are you happy or not? Are you paying attention to what's happening in your life? Are you joyful? Are you positive? Are you waking up and you feel safe? Or maybe you actually feel in a danger. Maybe you feel that you want to do some self-harm, and that could be potential sign of maybe you are in an abusive relationship, or maybe you were in an abusive relationship, and even though you're already out, you don't know how to overcome those habitual behaviors about abusive relationships, right? So what about self-neglect? So even the word itself, self-neglect, tells us a lot, right? It is about neglecting your body, neglecting your household, becoming a hoarder, right? Not looking after your health, not looking after what you're eating, right? It's pretty much completely and utterly avoiding to take care of yourself. And that's why it says self-neglect, right? And why it happens, because very often abuser is there for a while. Abuser is there threatening. Abuser is there probably telling things like, if you're going to go to police, they're going to kill you. And as a result, person lives in a fear. And as a result, they stop looking after themselves. But also very often it is about them living in a fear that if they're going to leave this abuser, they will not be able to find anybody else. And this is a very scary bit, because the truth is there are 7 billion people on this planet of Earth, maybe slightly less now after Corona, right? But unfortunately, totally unfortunately, but at the same time, there is no way you cannot find somebody with whom you can have healthy relationships, with whom you can have really joyful life. You can enjoy your moments. You can create beautiful, wonderful memories, and live in abundance, live in an amazing environment, instead of having lack of food, lack of shelter, lack of clothing, and everything else, right? So let's remember that actually this all is really important to know, to pay attention, to be aware of. And also, if you see signs somebody is showing one of these, that means most likely something is wrong. So it's important to double check with people. It's important to find out what's going on in their lives, and also to make sure that you are helping them in any possible way. But what's important to remember, and this is about how to leave these relationships, right? How to leave this relationship without waiting for too long. And I wish to bring you more stories, because I have endless stories about this, but I'm just quite mindful of your time, and I'm really grateful that you joined me today. What's important to remember here, that whether you are in this type of relationship or another person whom you know, it is important to leave these relationships. And especially, how can you prevent it, right? If you're going on a date and your partner, your date is telling you how in the past they were abusive to their partners, well, run. That's the only answer I can tell you and I can give you. Run away. Because if somebody was abusive before, if somebody was neglecting other people before, if somebody was giving silent treatments and shouting and nasty words at other people, who says they're not going to do it to you? Right? Again, past is our past, and our past doesn't determine our future. And I strongly believe in that, right? But you have to find out whether they have worked on that, because very often people become abusive, right? Nobody is born being an abusive person. There's no such a thing as a baby gets born and he or she becomes an abusive child, right? Is an abusive child, because they all become abusive based on what they have seen in their family, based on what they have seen possibly on television, based on what they heard from other people, based on what they have seen at the playground from other children who learn from their parents, right? And eventually and slowly, And also, especially if they were abused, they have so much anger within themselves that now they want to pay back that revenge. It could be not towards the abuser, but it could be towards the same gender, right? So this is quite complex topic. This is so life important topic. This is something what we need to address because both men, women from their childhood are abused, right? Whether it is sexually, whether they're neglected, whether it is verbally, whether it is financially, and many other types, as already said about. They are abused, and that's why, as a result, we are creating these generations and generations and generations of abusive relationships, abusive families. So to stop that, let's unite our powers together, right? Let's pay close attention to how people feel, what do they do, how do they behave, and let's analyze it, right? Why is that behavior there? Why are they so withdrawn? Why are they avoid eye contact? Why are they wearing the same clothing again and again? Why they never want, for example, invite you to their house? Or why when you come to their house, you see that they're living completely unlivable conditions, right? Pay close attention to your loved ones. Pay close attention to those who are your friends, who are your family members, who may be even your neighbors. Because sometimes it can happen literally next door. And because they are so frightened by their abuser, they will pretend that actually everything is amazing when things are not. I work with enough people to realize that it should be addressed as soon as possible. Not like my other client who was with her partner for 16 years. 16 years she was in relationships with this guy who was cheating on her, who was raping her, who was also beating her, and who was also verbally abusing her, right? And because in the beginning he was very charming, in the beginning he was very loving, in the beginning he was very Mr. Perfect, she just let it go once, and then twice, and then 3 times, and then, long story short, 16 years later, she came to see me and she said, Olga, I'm not sure what shall I do. And she said, right now he left me, but he left me for another woman. And I'm not sure what shall I do. Because he was still contacting her, he was still keeping her in fear. And the truth is, of course abuser will threaten you. Of course abuser will tell you awful things. Of course abuser will send you awful messages, right? Of course abuser will react or overreact on your normal question, why do you behave like that? Or why do you treat me like that? Because they don't want to be confronted. And of course, they will threaten you. If you're going to go to police, they will kill you. The chances are, very rarely they will, right? They will threaten you so you don't do it, right? So don't risk your lifelong relationship this way. In that case, just if you are in this type of relationship, just run. Just run, because very often it takes time for abusers to understand that we're doing something completely wrong. And very rarely you are the person who can open their eyes. Because if you will be the one, by now they'll be already aware of that. Right? So Anastasia, thank you so much for sharing this message on Facebook. Will be great collaborate with you with this job. Yes, absolutely, we can talk about this. I'm very passionate about this topic, Anastasia, because as I said, so many of my clients told me about this directly or indirectly through the coaching process. And very often what happens, people would come to me to work on various things. They would say, I need to progress with my career, or I struggle with love direction, could you help me? Or they would say, I'm really depressed and I have suicidal thoughts. Or they would say even things like, I need to get some clarity. I want to achieve a lot. I need some clarity. Could you please help me? And what's interesting in the discussion, very often they would say, I wonder if we can talk about my relationships. And I always say, of course we can. Your relationship affects your life, and your life affects your relationship, right? And also it affects your career affects your relationship. So it goes in a circle, right? And that's why I call it mindset coaching, because it is about mindset. It is about challenging yourself here, changing yourself here in order to improve your life, right? But as you can see, one area can affect others a lot more, especially if you are experiencing abuse. Because when you are in abusive relationships, and this is what's interesting, you start underperforming. But there's a very interesting trait what happens, particularly with men, when they are abused at home. It could be silent treatments, it could be them being demasculinized because the women are very masculine, very strong, and maybe she calls him names, maybe she doesn't respect him. Now at work, he becomes very aggressive and he becomes very manipulative and he becomes very harsh, right? So please pay attention. Please pay attention to what happens to your co-workers, to what happens to your managers, to what happens to your employees, because very often that would indicate they are in abusive relationships. As I said in the very beginning, both men and women suffer from abuse. Let's remember. Anastasia, thank you so much for such a heartfelt and vulnerable share. Myself, as I was in this situation, witnessed all my life, and now do work with, is it Latvian? Oh yeah, Latvian community now too in the UK. Yes, Anastasia, and I can relate to that too, because as I experienced it myself, again, I don't go back to that because, you know, it's about overcoming that, it's about learning from that, it's about moving on from that. But I can relate to that because in my case, it was emotional abuse. In my case, it was verbal abuse. It was also abuse of my possessions. And this is how I knew that that is not normal, right? And this is how I knew that's it, go. And of course, I was threatened. Of course, I was told many nasty things. But you have to step up for yourself. So if I did that, if many of my clients did that, if you go to my YouTube channel, you can see some of my guests also experience that stuff. You will understand that you also can do that, right? So let's combine our powers together. Let's help each other. Let's help community. Let's help those families to have better relationships, not only now, but also in the future, by addressing the issues when people don't feel happy, when people don't feel that they are in a healthy and happy relationships, right? You can make a difference, but it takes one voice to be outspoken. It takes one report, takes one message, it takes one call to make this change to appear in the world, right? Together we can make a difference. You know that the power is in togetherness. So thank you so much, everybody who stayed with me till the very end, or if you join me later. I so appreciate you joining me today in this topic. I really wish we can address this and share this message with as many people as we can, because as I said, so many people need to hear that. So many, both men and women, need to realize what is abuse, what are the signs of abuse, because very often they don't even understand that they are in abusive relationships. So please share this video with people whom you see it will be useful for them. Please make sure you discuss it with people. If you see the signs, as discussed, just watch the video again if you want. If you see the signs of some people having potentially from the abuse, whichever type it is, talk to them, question them, and make sure that you address the issue, because very often it means that they are too scared, they're too frightened, they're probably threatened, and they cannot deal with that, right? So let's make sure together we make a huge difference in the world. So thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart for joining me today. It was a really important session for me today, because it was on behalf of my clients, it was on behalf of myself as well, because many years ago, I also was in a similar position. But again, I don't talk about this much because I moved on. And you can move on to your colleague, your friend, your family member, all of them can move on as well. But it takes some steps, some effort, and some courage, right? So be courageous. Be brave, step in, step up, and let's help each other to have extraordinary life. Thank you so much for joining me. Oh, thank you, Antonio, for your great comment. Thank you. Very insightful. Thank you so much. Really understand. Really appreciate that. And Anastasia, thank you so much for this comment. Please contact me later, please. And we should support each other. I have to go now. Sorry. Thanks for your work. You're so welcome, my darling Anastasia. Thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate you. And I really appreciate everybody who joined me today and shared where you're based. I'm so happy to see that we went today international, because this message needs to be heard across all countries, across all continents, across all religions, across all cultures, because it happens across the world and also in between both genders, right? So make sure you spread the word. Let's make the world a much better place to live. And thank you once more for joining me today. And by the way, on Monday, I'm coming back at 7:30 a.m. UK time on LinkedIn with 10 minutes of inspiration. So join me and let's pump up the week with a high energy. But whatever you do this weekend, make sure you enjoy your weekend, you stay safe, and you look after yourself and others. Sending you much love. I appreciate you. Thank you.